Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a really specific worldview, one that ties together global politics, Donald Trump, and a belief in a worldwide spiritual war. It's all based on a video from a channel called A Righteous Perspective. Okay, let's dive right in.
So we kick things off with what is probably their single most surprising claim, that the fastest growing Christian church in the entire world isn't somewhere in the Americas or Europe, but in the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And how do they back that up? Well, one speaker points to a statistic from 2023. They claim that an absolutely staggering 50,000 mosques in Iran, out of 75,000, had to shut their doors because no one was showing up. For them, this is a clear sign of a massive religious shift.
And they argue this isn't just happening in Iran. They see a huge Christian revival sweeping across the Muslim world. They specifically point to places like Indonesia, Egypt, and even Gaza as hotspots where they believe God is moving in a really powerful way.
For them, you have to understand this isn't just some social trend. They see it as proof of direct, divine intervention happening right now. As one speaker put it, Jesus is not just a fairy tale 2,000 years ago. He's still alive and moving on the earth today. So, what do they think is causing this major shift on the ground? Well, they point their finger at one very specific political figure and the actions he took on the world stage.
The speakers lay out what they see as a recurring three-step pattern in Donald Trump's foreign policy. First, he takes some kind of decisive action. Second, the media absolutely condemns it. But third, they claim the actual people in that country secretly rejoice.
And they give a few examples to drive this home. In Iran, they claim the population was celebrating after a strike on what they call a plant. In Nigeria, they say the people were thrilled after U.S. Special Forces were sent in to fight extremists. And in Venezuela, they allege he got 800 pastors freed with just a threat. And in every single one of these cases, they argue the official story you heard was the total opposite of how the people actually felt.
So from this perspective, Trump isn't just a president. He's seen as a historical agent of God. They compare him to figures like Cyrus, a non-Jewish king who God used to free the Israelites, and King David, the warrior king. In their eyes, Trump is a modern-day version of that, chosen to tear down corrupt systems.
Okay, this is where it all starts to connect to a much larger picture. All of these earthly events, they believe, are tied to a massive, unseen conflict that's happening behind the scenes.
At the very heart of this worldview is this concept of spiritual warfare. The idea is that the physical wars we see on the news are just a shadow, a reflection of a much more significant battle happening in the spiritual realm.
You know, one of the speakers uses a pretty interesting analogy from the movie Doctor Strange to explain it. He says just like the Avengers handle the physical threats you can see, the church is supposed to handle the mystical, invisible threats, the ones you can't see.
And this belief actually translates into a very specific strategy, say for a country like Iran. In their view, it's a three-pronged attack. You have Israel going after the men, Trump going after the machines, and then the church's role is to go after the demonic forces behind it all. It's a coordinated assault on both physical and spiritual fronts.
And this spiritual framework then becomes the lens they use to interpret what other world leaders are doing. They see them as actors on this grand prophetic stage.
For them, it is absolutely no coincidence that Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were in power at the same time. They believe God put them together for a very specific purpose, describing them as being yoked like oxen to do his work. They tell this very specific story about Netanyahu's career. According to them, he was first removed from office because he agreed to divide the land of Israel. But while he was out of power, they say a prophet told him God would put him back, but with one critical warning: do not divide my land.
And really, this all comes back to a biblical foundation for their whole perspective. They argue that the land of Israel is literally God's land, and that this verse from Genesis is a timeless principle that determines how nations will rise and fall.
But here's where things get a bit more complex. This viewpoint isn't some uniform, monolithic belief. When you listen closely, you start to hear a surprising spectrum of opinions, and even some moral discomfort from the speakers themselves.
So on one hand, you've got a really strong endorsement. This speaker basically says he wants a commander-in-chief who projects power, someone who makes it clear to the world that America is not to be messed with. But then, on the other hand, another speaker voices some clear reservations. He says, very plainly, that he didn't vote for this. He didn't vote for military action in other countries, even if he sort of accepts that some good things might come from it.
And this is what's so fascinating, right? Even inside this group that agrees on the big picture, you've got this whole range. It goes from wholehearted support for these actions to a kind of hesitant acceptance of the results, all the way to outright discomfort with how it's done.
So, what's the big takeaway? For the speakers in this video, politics, military strikes, and global revival aren't just separate, random events. No, they are all deeply interconnected pieces of a cosmic story that's unfolding according to a divine prophetic plan.
And ultimately, this whole perspective is just a fascinating case study. It shows how a deeply held spiritual belief system can completely transform how you see global politics, turning leaders into biblical figures and news headlines into battles in a cosmic war. And it leaves us with a bigger question, one for all of us. How do our own beliefs, spiritual or not, shape the way we make sense of this complex and often chaotic world?